All right, in this video, we are going to talk about acreages. And I know a lot about acreages because I grew up on an acreage north of Edmonton in Sturgeon County. And we had the worst thing happen to us because my parents knew nothing about acreage. I remember being 12 years old and going out for a Sunday drive, and my parents found that the birds were singing and thought this would be great to live out on an acreage and raise the family. But it turned quickly into a nightmare. They didn't know anything about well water, they didn't know anything about septic fields and septic tanks, and it was crazy. So in this video, I'm gonna help you not make the same mistake that my parents did. All right, the first thing you absolutely have to be concerned with is very obvious, but it's water. And you know, if you're a city slicker, you kind of take water for granted because it just, you pay your utilities, you get water. Well, it's a whole different thing when it comes to acreages. You are going to be on a well for the most part. And you can get into a cistern system, which we'll talk about in a minute. But for a well, you have to be really concerned with, well, how deep is the well? And we have to be looking at how many gallons per minute. Now around Calgary, we've got Rocky View County that's close to Calgary, kind of go in the shape of a horseshoe around the city. We have Foothills County, which is on the southern end of Calgary, and we've got Wheatland County to the east of us. And that's primarily the big acreage country, for around the Calgary area. And interestingly enough, every one of these counties within them have certain areas where there's quite a bit of water and there's areas where there isn't so much water. So you have to be really concerned about that. So it's really important to understand what the gallons per minute that the water is pumping out. Because if you have a large family, you're gonna wind up like we did when I was 12 years old. The well only pumped about 2 gallons per minute, and we had 7 people living in the house. So of course the pump ran dry and it wrecked the pump and we had no water, and it was terrible. And it always happens at the worst possible time, like -30 in the winter or something stupid like that, right? So you have to gauge how much water you might use. It's fine to have 1 or 2 gallons per minute, depending on how you set it up, whether you have some reserve tank or how many people are living in the home. So that's the first thing you have to consider when it comes to water. The other thing you have to think about when it comes to water is what is actually in the water, because you want to have the water tested in a laboratory. That's another thing that my parents didn't do, and guess what? We had a lot of iron in our water, which was not good because it actually made everything yellow. And the worst of it was we had a little too much sulfur. Excuse me, but that doesn't smell good. Sulfur, not good. I sometimes wondered if I smelled better before I went into the bath as opposed to when I came back out. So having it tested at a laboratory is very important, and also to find out if you have high levels of bacteria. All right, septic tanks and septic fields. Not the funnest topic to discuss, but it's really, really important because, of course, we have to get rid of the waste coming from the household. And the first thing is the septic tank, of course, it does collect the solids, and that does need to be tested and checked. And you want to hire an expert that does this on a regular basis, a company that is well known, and actually check and make sure that that is working properly. Because if the person who owns the acreage right now has not had that cleaned and checked themselves, there could be some issues with it, and it can get quite costly. Then you have to look at the septic field. Going back to my experience as a child, that's the other thing, our septic field wasn't big enough for all of the wastewater that was coming from the house. And of course, it filled right up. And guess what happens when your septic field fills up and it has nowhere to go? It comes back into your basement. Not very pleasant. And again, it usually happens and it's cold in the winter, which is exactly what happened to us. So this is an important part of making a choice on a property for an acreage that a lot of people just don't think about because they get so wrapped up in just looking at the home and the lifestyle. And of course, if you don't put this into your offer and do a lot of the background checks on this, you could end up having some really costly repairs, and we don't want that to happen to you. So that's why you want to look at some of this stuff when you're making your offer on a property. Hey, if you are finding this video to be very informative, do me a favor, just like the video, that would be great. You can subscribe to it because I do these weekly, and you can hit the bell and get notified every time I put one out. Let's talk a little bit about encroachments and easements, which is quite often something you face when you have acreages. So an easement or an encroachment is essentially an agreement between both parties, between you and your neighbor, that gets registered on title. That agreement is now in place and in stone forever. So nothing to worry about it if it's registered on the title. A lot of people just take roads for granted. You know, there's a road going up, you know, from the main road up to your house. And don't always consider that a lot of these roads, when they're put in to save money, oftentimes they are actually in an encroachment agreement, or there's an easement on your neighbor's property. In fact, we even saw one of those on a septic field at one time. The septic field wasn't even on the property that you would own. It was on the neighbor's, and there was an easement for that. Now, an easement is okay because it's registered on the title, and it means that there's an agreement in place, just like an encroachment. If it's registered on the title and there's an agreement that has been put in place with the neighbor, it's perfectly okay because you have use of that particular driveway. However, there can be a negative. Because what if you're sharing that driveway and the neighbor decides that they want to park something on there? They have every right to do that too, which I have seen cause some issues. So you want to look carefully at those situations. They're not all bad. I'm a big fan of certain situations where they just work and there's no choice and the property has so many great features that it's okay for it. But in other situations, I would stay away from it. So you have to really analyze this carefully, and you need someone like me to kind of guide you through it. All right, the value of acreage is actually very interesting. Oftentimes I have people that'll say to me, well, hey, if it's got 4 acres, or if it's got 6 acres, or it has 10 acres, logically the land value would go up incrementally with how much land I have. And that's really not how acreages necessarily work. You have to really consider, it really depends on what each person would do with that land. If there's actually a purpose where maybe if it's big enough to put horses and you're a horse person, well, obviously you'd probably pay a little more for that. Or if you're gonna run a hobby farm. But 2 acres or 4 acres doesn't necessarily equate to a vast difference in pricing. I mean, it can in certain situations, but in many situations, because the land itself is not being used for anything other than just having, you know, extra space, doesn't necessarily dramatically increase the price of the property. So you have to consider that, and there's no magical formula to what an extra 1 or 2 acres is. A lot of it has to do with the location. What it offers is it has trees, is there mountain views, is there rolling hills. All of that can pay part of the equation and the purpose, of course, is what the buyer would do with the property. So we really have to analyze all of that. But what I'm getting at, and I want you to get out of this video, is that it's not black and white. That's the thing. There's just no black and white for how much price per acre when it comes to just small acreages. One of the things I often get asked is, they'll say, Rob, can you find me a 2 or 4 acre parcel of land because I'd like to build my dream home on it. And I want it to be within 30 minutes to Calgary. I actually get that request a lot. And it's not easy to do. Or the other one I get is, well, could maybe we buy, you know, a larger parcel of land and we'll just get it subdivided. Well, I'm going to tell you right now, subdivision is not easy to do. Rocky View is a lot tougher than Wheatland County, and Foothills County is also very difficult. Subdivision is quite the process. So I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm just saying you're in for a long process, and unless you're willing to hold the land for quite a while and go through that, you may find that it's not a best scenario for you. But then finding these 2 acres or 4 acres are not easy either, because when they do get subdivided, a lot of developers tend to go through that process, and then of course they want to build some luxury real estate and do a whole subdivision. And they put a lot of rules in these subdivisions as well. Many of them even have rules where you can't even park a holiday trailer on them, so that they keep the integrity of the subdivision looking really good and luxurious. So I know quite often too, people will say, hey, I've got a business and I want to be able to park my my tractor trailer on there, or I want to be able to, park a lot of equipment on there. Well, of course, that's not something that the counties necessarily want to see, so there can be some real strict rules around that too. Now, getting back to the fact that you want to build your dream house, you have to really take into consideration does this lot have services up to it? Sometimes the gas, the electrical, the power and everything is not coming up to the lot. You have to factor that in because you're going to have to put all that in, of course, if you're going to own something or build something. And here's the biggest one that I come across is that people quite often want to finance both buying the lot and then building the dream home after. It's really difficult to do both. Getting a builder construction loan can be really difficult if the lot isn't already paid for. So there's some challenges around the financial part of that as well. That's why it's so much easier if we could just find you the right house, even if it has to be modified, is probably a better option than just trying to find a vacant lot and then building a dream house, unless you've got a fair amount of cash and at least to be able to buy the lot outright. I hope this video has been helpful. I've touched on some key components of buying an acreage or selling an acreage. I didn't get into everything. There is more depending on the situation. There's a lot of different situations when it comes to acreages, and that's why you want to hire somebody who really understands everything you need to consider when buying or selling an acreage. And I recently put out this book, actually. I have one for sellers, I have one for buyers. This happens to be my buyer book. And I've got some information in here as well for purchasing acreages along with purchasing properties in the city. And I'm willing to send that to you if you just want to send a request. And if you have found these videos to be helpful, please just feel free to subscribe. And of course you can hit the bell and get notified when new ones come in. And of course you can like this video too if you found it. That's also been very helpful to you. Acreages are awesome. The lifestyle is great. You just really have to make sure you get the right advice and you can be able to go in with your eyes wide open. That's the key.